Welcome, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Today is Yom HaShoah. This is Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it's opportune that we have this conversation on this day and this week. So I'd like to tell you a little bit more in a moment. I have the honor of introducing Professor Margarete Feinstein, and before I do, I've also been invited to be the warm-up band before Professor Feinstein. So you'll indulge me. Professor Feinstein has been researching the post-war period and focusing on Jewish displaced persons. And I would like to tell you a little bit about a particular displaced persons camp in southern Germany. My name is Etty Zilber, and I am what's called a second generation. My parents both survived the Holocaust. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the displaced persons camp that they were in. All right. This camp was in Landsberg am Lech, which is about 100 kilometers west of Munich in southern Germany. It was one of the biggest DP camps in Europe. And I'd like to introduce you to my mother's family. The girl toward the right next to the man, that's my mom. She was about 17 at this time. And my grandfather, Yaakov, my grandmother, Etta. I'm named after Etta. And my mother had 3 younger sisters. Of this family, only my mother and one sister survived. Now, my mother's story is reflected in a book that I've published, but it also parallels my father's story with his family because they were also from the city of Kovno, Kaunas, Lithuania. All right, so this whole thing, their whole experience took place in Eastern Europe. And this is my grandmother, Haicha, my grandfather, Feivel. My father is that cute little boy over there. And unfortunately, his little sister's cut off here. And she's still alive. And she was online at one of my presentations this week. And her head is 100% accurate. It's amazing. She's 91. So both those stories are in parallel, both before the war, during the war, and after the war. And I tell this story in one of my presentations entitled As Mama Told Us, from her testimony. Now, I'm not going to tell you all about that whole history, except that this took place in Lithuania, the Russian occupation, the German occupation, the ghettoization, the massacres by Lithuanians against the Jews even before the Nazis came in. The life, the death, the forced labor, you've heard it all. Marriage, that's an interesting thing that took place in the ghetto. An escape, liquidation of the ghetto and the trains, the concentration camps they were sent to, the death marches, liberation, and 4 years of DP camps, displaced persons camp. So let me introduce you, and I give a separate presentation just on that period of time, which is, the title is very alliterated. And this tells in more detail what I'm giving you today. So let me take you to one particular DP camp, Landsberg am Lech. It was, if not the biggest, the second biggest. There were 5,000 Jews in this DP camp. All right. And these are the members of my family that were reunited after the war. They were not together during the war all the time. And you have my mother and my father up and back. They had married in the ghetto. Her one surviving sister over on the right, Nechama, and my aunt, who's still alive, down in the left, Rivka, and my grandmother and grandfather, Haicha and Feivel Sidrel. And that is a miracle story of the Holocaust because my father's family, a nuclear family of 4, going through what in our family, we call the full Monty of the Holocaust, survived, and that is a miracle story. There were very, very few stories like that. Now, once they got to the DP camp, they all had to find work. And so you see my mother up at the top. She was working in a medical clinic. All right. My grandfather was an electrician. My grandmother was a seamstress. And my father got a job in the motor pool. So they always had transportation. He always had access to wheels, as he said, and they used it quite often to travel around and actually try to have some kind of fun and a decent life and normal life. My the two aunts were sent to what was then called a kibbutz or akshara, training for immigration to Palestine. And so they were in a separate facility. Life in this DP camp was almost like a mirror image of life before the war, with all of the institutions that were set up in this camp. It was a beehive, as they call it, a beehive of activity there, trying to address every single one of the needs of the survivors in this camp. So you can see all of the institutions that were set up. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I am going to pinpoint a few that Professor Feinstein has also researched. All right. One of the biggest institutions was education, and ALT, this organization ALT for rehabilitation through training, set up stations throughout many DP camps. This was the headquarters here in Landsberg. And that's a photo of my father coming out of one of the training sessions with a brochure in his hand about electronics, which was my father's passion, and he eventually became an electronic engineer. But they had courses for everything in order to prepare the DPs, the survivors, for future skills, because most of these survivors were so young. That was the majority of those who survived were young, and they had no skills. And so these vocational courses helped them. There were also tremendous efforts to collect information and record the history. People did want to talk at that time. They only shut up in later years because nobody wanted to listen. Anyway, so there were calls all the time, come and record, tell your story, be interviewed. And this went on for a number of years in the DP camps. All sorts of calls for recording the history. And also there were calls for drawing, to artists to draw pictures of what they went through. And this particular drawing was done by my grandfather, Feivel, from memory, of the day in the ghetto when they took 10,000 people out of the ghetto and sent them to be shot at the 9th Fort up the hill. If you look, you can see the people going up the hill. So that was another thing that was done. This particular book was written 440 pages, and I know them very well because I just translated all of them from Yiddish to English, and it'll be published shortly in the Yisker Book Project. And this was based on interviews with survivors from my parents' city, Kovno, Kaunas. And so this is another piece of evidence of what happened. There were sports groups, and you see a picture of the basketball players, and my mother put an arrow to my father, who's obviously playing basketball there. That was his NBA career. And there were recreational activities. Here's my mother in the center with her two friends with tennis rackets. And there were choral activities. And I circled my mother and my two aunts who were singing in a chorus there. And I know that you were researching these activities. And there was also theater activities. And you see here the theater group. My aunt is performing in this theater group in the DP camp. And this was the entire troupe from the theater. And my grandfather is a third from the left, next to my aunt, who's second on the left, he was involved in overseeing the actual theater and the premises and the organization. This is another program from a dramatic production. There were holiday ceremonies, and these are my two aunts singing in a Hanukkah ceremony. And there are, of course, Zionist activities going on. And both of my aunts, you see on the two ends there, this was a demonstration to open up immigration to Palestine at the time. All right. There were many marriages in the camps, and there were many problems as a result. And Professor Feinstein has written about some of the challenges in proving that your spouse was dead. That was a huge problem. And of course, after the marriage comes the biggest baby boom in history. And these are photos from Landsberg with all the new babies in the baby carriages. And this was a time when people were trying to gain some normalcy, and my parents were finally together at this time, and the result was me. So that was me. This is personal. And so everybody started looking for a new home at that time. Most of the Jews from eastern part of Europe had no desire to stay, and there's many reasons for that. And so they all decided to look for other places. And from liberation in 1945, we received the visa in 1950. That's 5 years later, when the United States government finally adapted or modified the quota system. And so we got on this ship in 1950, and these are photos of Mom and I, and we arrived in the United States and stayed here. So that's just a little warm up before I introduce Professor Feinstein. Margarete Myers Feinstein received her Ph.D. in history from the University of California at Davis. She's currently Associate Director and Clinical Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies at Loyola Marymount University. She is interested in the legacies of Nazism. Feinstein is the author of State Symbols, The Quest for Legitimacy in the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic, and Holocaust Survivors in Postwar Germany. Her publications related to literature and representations of the Holocaust include articles on theater in the displaced persons camps, images of parenthood in Holocaust survivor narratives, and a reassessment of Jewish rage in the works of Elie Wiesel. Feinstein's current book project uses survivor narratives to investigate retribution against Germans after the Holocaust. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Feinstein.
Well, thank you, Eddie. I appreciate that introduction. And I just want to thank the organizer of the conference, Tim Langell, the Rosenbluth Family Charitable Foundation, ASU School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, also ASU Jewish Studies, and other sponsors. This has been just a remarkable experience to be here, and I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share my work with you. I just want to echo something that Dr. Cushman said earlier. The panel this morning was very moving and very humbling. And I have to admit, I thought, well, how can I connect my work? I mean, this is history, and it's actually sort of has a sort of a happy ending. But I realized that work is, and saying these Holocaust survivors who were displaced persons, is showing that the Holocaust didn't end with the liberation of the camps and with the end of the war. Displacement was a continuation of those trying times of the persecution, even as it provided an opportunity to start rebuilding their lives. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about now. So let's see. So Margaret Hoymann recalls her April 1945 liberation in Bergen-Belsen by British forces. Then the medic people came in to take care of the sick. And then they decided that since I was a German Jew, they wouldn't take care of me because I was a German. And then I decided, well, if they don't want to treat me as a German, then I'll become a Czech. And so I went back and I said, I'm Czech, and they treated me. So in the chaotic period of the waning days of the war and its aftermath, German and Austrian Jews frequently faced such treatment. And going forward, I'm just going to say German Jews, and it refers to German-speaking Jews, so includes the Austrians. But determined not to repeat the mistakes of the Nazis, Allied troops and military government officials, what's the wrong thing?
You're down.
Yeah. Often considered nationality as a determining factor in individual status. Right, because they didn't want to separate the Jews out because that's what the Nazis had done. They're not going to be like the Nazis. But this well-intentioned practice had the unintended consequence of stigmatizing German Jews as enemy nationals and of denying them the rightful access to assistance from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, known by its acronym UNRWA. So while this unfortunate episode is familiar to some scholars of post-war history, it may still come as a surprise that thousands of German Jews did succeed in acquiring UNRWA support as displaced persons or DPs. But unlike other DPs, such as the ones that Eddie just introduced us to, German Jews shared a common culture and history and language with the perpetrators of the Holocaust. The language they spoke identified them as Germans, providing them with both opportunities and difficulties as they navigated the complex post-war world. The disadvantages of being German speakers were most evident outside of Germany's borders, but also within the confines of the mostly Eastern European population of the DP camps. On these occasions, German was the language of the oppressor. And it was all too easy to confuse German Jews with German perpetrators and to treat them as enemy nationals. At the same time, German language skills allowed for easier border crossings, since Jews could pose as ethnic Germans or as German prisoners of war returning home. For those not wanting to live in displaced persons camps, their language ability facilitated interactions with the German authorities responsible for their housing and ration cards that were issued to free-living DPs. It also allowed them to seek retribution through assisting in the apprehension and prosecution of war criminals. Intending to leave Germany, German Jewish DPs occupied an uncomfortable space between their former fellow countrymen and their as yet unknown future homes. So I want to talk a little bit about the sort of the legal status of German Jews. I haven't been able to determine the precise number of German Jews who claim DP status. Most German Jews had been stripped of their German citizenship by the end of the war. And so many of those who became DPs may have initially been included under the category of stateless. And so we wouldn't know that they were German Jews, they were just stateless. Others, such as Margaret Heumann, in the story I opened with, may have claimed another nationality in order to acquire DP status when they were confronted with anti-German Allied personnel. And then since few survivors had identification papers, their word was often taken as fact. And as a result, they would be numbered under their assumed nationality. But putting together records from UNRWA and also from the American Joint Jewish Distribution Committee, also known as JDC or the Joint, I've been able to piece together that at least 8,000 surviving German Jews became DPs at some point after liberation. So already in June 1944, the UNRWA Second Council session had determined that UNRWA would be allowed to care for and return to their home anyone, even non-Allied nationals, who had been forced to leave their former residence or had been deported, quote, by action of the enemy because of their race, religion, or activities in favor of the United Nations. So German Jews would have been included in this group. As an example of how this didn't always get through, sorry that the copy isn't very good. I mean, this is the way the original looks, but it's the last paragraph there. It's just telling the story about how Washington first decided that the 1,500 Austrian Jews in Palestine who wanted to return to Austria were not eligible because for UNRWA assistance. But it then says it is now recommended that since they are refugees because of their race and religion and left their homes after January 1938, that they should be given UNRWA care. So again, there's this delay. At first there's a no, you don't qualify. And then, oh yeah, actually you do. So clearly, there was a hard time getting the word out, and the Displaced Persons Branch of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, known as SHAEF, and its successor organization repeatedly issued memoranda to military commanders informing them of the displaced person status of and the priority of care for stateless people and for enemy and ex-enemy nationals who had been persecuted. And yet, despite these efforts, reports continued to emerge that German Jews were being treated as enemy nationals. In June 1945, SHAEF finally began creating camps for stateless DPs. And by later in the summer, they're going to be creating camps specifically for Jewish DPs. But in Theresienstadt, approximately 800, mostly German Jewish survivors had refused repatriation. They did not want to go back to be Germans or Austrians, but they were in danger of being forced out by the Soviet military authorities. So the Red Army occupied Eastern Europe, including Czechoslovakia, where Theresienstadt was located, and also the eastern zone of occupied Germany. The British, Americans, and French had occupation zones in the German West and South. But so this is the thing, Soviet policy did not permit the creation of displaced persons camps. The Soviets, their attitude was, you either go home or you stay where you are and settle in the local community. And that's not what the survivors of Theresienstadt wanted. They wanted a third option. They wanted to be able to emigrate somewhere else. And so what ends up happening is that representatives from the JDC sought assistance from SHAEF and from diplomatic officials to get permission to transport the survivors out of Theresienstadt and to a DP camp in the American zone of occupied Germany. And after some delays, 700 survivors of Theresienstadt began leaving in late June and early July 1945 for Germany. And I'll return to their DP experience a little bit later. But right now I want to look at how other German Jews struggled to get out of Eastern Europe when they did not want to accept repatriation. These Jews, because they refused repatriation, were left to fend for themselves. And, outside of Germany, being German or speaking German could be dangerous. Those seeking vengeance did not always distinguish between German Jews and German perpetrators, especially since German Jews were presumed to be dead. So many German Jewish survivors smuggled themselves into Austria or Germany on their way to destinations outside of Europe. And one example is William Safran, who traveled with 5 other Jewish German survivors and one Polish Jew to Lodz, where they had heard there was a Jewish committee. Making the mistake of speaking German in public, the German Jews were arrested and jailed overnight. Fortunately, the Polish survivor was able to explain who they were and secured their release from jail. After a brief stay in Poland, Safran decided to leave Europe. He bribed Soviet soldiers to take him to Berlin, where he entered the Schlachtensee DP camp as a Jew. For Safran, his German background had been a liability, and the return to Germany was only a means to leaving Europe. Meanwhile, post-war Czech authorities classified German-speaking Jews as Germans, and returning survivors there had difficulties regaining their Czech citizenship and reclaiming property. Some were even expelled as Germans to Germany. Sorry about that. There we go. Oh. So this was the group, some people liberating Theresienstadt, and that's a drawing by one of the survivors of Theresienstadt. So here's the uprooted ethnic Germans. During the end of the war, Germany was already moving Germans back. There were German refugees fleeing from Eastern Europe, fleeing ahead of the Red Army. But you also had evacuees, people who were living in the cities that were now being heavily bombed. And so they were being evacuated to the countryside where local Germans would have to host them in their homes, leading to some very tense situations. But also in 1946, Czechoslovakia, Poland are going to start expelling ethnic Germans. Basically, we're not going to give the Germans another excuse to invade us, because Hitler had used the excuse of German minorities not being treated well in Eastern Europe as his fig leaf legitimation for invading. And so they're just like, we're going to get rid of them all, and so kick them all out. But this actually created an opportunity for German-speaking Jews to enter into these groups and make their way back into Germany. So that's part of what's happening here. So one of these Jews is Norbert Adler, who'd been born and raised in Germany as a German citizen. His mother was a German Jew. His father, though, was a naturalized German, having been born in Poland. And so they were stripped of their German citizenship by the Nazis, and the family was deported to Poland in 1938. After the war, Adler married a Romanian Jewish woman, and they decided to emigrate. They made it as far as Bratislava when Adler saw a sign in German that read, in translation, "If you want to go home to the Reich, come here." So many people had lost their papers during the war. So he went in and he said, I don't have my papers, but his fluent German and Berlin dialect helped him to successfully pose as a German, and he was issued a visa to Germany. Once in Germany, however, Adler and his wife lived as Jewish displaced persons until their immigration to Israel. So in this case, the ability to present himself as a German had worked to his advantage. Inge Deutschkron ended up becoming a famous West German journalist and wrote a memoir about her experiences. She and her mother survived the war hiding in Berlin. But at a certain point, when bombings were increasing, it was getting more and more dangerous being in Berlin, they actually escaped and went eastward, the opposite direction of everybody else. Went eastward so that they could then join one of these refugee streams and come back into Berlin and claim that they were refugees from the East, and they were able to get ration cards and housing that way. So again, able to use their German as a way to fool the authorities. Ruth Kluger, some of you may know from her memoir, Still Alive. She and her mother and a young friend were Viennese Jews who escaped from a death march and passed themselves off as ethnic German refugees, and even lived as such in Straubing, this town here, for a few weeks before liberation. And then once the Americans arrived, they revealed their identities as Jews and became so-called free living DPs. I mean, they didn't go into a DP camp. Instead, they were given a requisitioned apartment to live in. It was difficult for them living among Germans they suspected to be hostile. For example, Kluger's tutors included former Nazis. Also, the local housing officer, while they were out of town, had moved a Nazi into their apartment and expected them to share with him. So Kluger's mother filed complaints with the JDC to get him evicted, and actually resulted in an investigation of the local government and the local military government also. They then moved on, They then moved on to Regensburg, where Kluger attended university. And what's interesting here is that she gravitated toward the German students and found herself critical and sort of even embarrassed by the Eastern European Jews who were at the university. And so Kluger chose a German identity within the university setting, and yet she identified herself as a Jew and did not wish to remain in Germany or to return to Austria. And so for Kluger and many German Jewish survivors, the relationship to their German and Jewish identities were one of ongoing negotiation. For the German Jews who chose to become DPs, Germany had ceased to be their homeland. And unlike Jews who chose to stay and who had to find ways to accommodate themselves to post-war German society, German Jewish DPs felt estranged from their former compatriots and experienced greater freedom in confronting Germans for their crimes. So Anita Lassner, a survivor of Auschwitz and Belsen, wrote in her memoir, "It would not have crossed our minds to consider Germany or Breslau, by then in Russian hands, as our home." In a similar vein, another survivor, Ruth Foster, in her videotaped interview at the Shoah Foundation, mentions her hometown of Lingen before correcting herself, preferring to call it her place of birth. And she went on to recount how she swam across a river rather than wait with the German refugees to cross the bridge linking the Soviet and American zones of occupation. She did not want to be associated with the Germans. Betrayals that these Jewish Germans had experienced had created an unbridgeable chasm between them and other Germans. Their sense of distance from and even disdain for Germans, combined with their ability to perform German identity, gave German Jewish DPs a unique opportunity to exact retribution. The Allies often employed German and American refugees as war crimes officers and legal advisors, but there were some Allied officers without the requisite language skills who then hired interpreters, often from among the local DP population. Working as an interpreter for British war crimes investigators, Lassner wrote of her hatred for Germans, "It goes so deep that if I have to speak to them, and for me in my capacity as an interpreter, this happens frequently, I have to turn away from them to stop myself hitting them in the face, every single one of them, even if they have not done anything to me personally." Not all German Jews were as restrained and refrained from striking out. In particular, men who aided Allied war crimes investigators found themselves in a position to exact vengeance. Liberated from Mauthausen, Siegbert Wildzig went to work for the US Counterintelligence Corps in Linz, Austria, where he reported to a US major whom he suspected of being a German Jew. Within 2 weeks, Wildzig was speaking the local dialect, and he recalls that the Germans were unsuspecting that a Jew would speak their language. Wildzig's team took the springs out of their van, although they didn't want to kill anyone, they did want to give their prisoner, quote, "a ride he will remember," end quote. So all told, Wildzig found 14 Nazis and turned them over to the Americans. And another example, before immigrating to the United States, German Jewish survivor Berthold Strauss combined his quest for retribution with vengeance while working with the US Army to locate National Socialists in the area around his hometown in Germany. On patrol with a team, they picked up a German hitchhiker. Strauss struck up a conversation with him and, just brought the conversation around to, "So are there any Jews in the area?" And the man confided that no, there weren't any, they were all killed. And if they weren't all killed, Hitler should have killed all of them anyway. At that point, Strauss revealed his identity as a Jewish survivor, one of the Jews who had not been killed. He persuaded the US sergeant who was in charge of the patrol to leave him alone with the man. And this is what Strauss said. "I believe that all the rage and all the anger and all the frustrations I had accumulated from 1932 on to 1945, I released on that man. I did not kill him. I didn't want to kill him. I wanted him to live for the rest of his life remembering me, a Jew who had survived." Strauss was satisfied that the man had been hospitalized with injuries similar to those that Strauss's father had suffered on Kristallnacht. So in this example, Strauss's ability to pose as a German non-Jew prompted the other man to expose his anti-Semitism. Other DPs who participated in the apprehension and interrogation of war criminals may also have disguised their Jewishness in order to lull the Germans into lowering their guard. And although they did not always take physical revenge, as Strauss did, they often did see their contribution to the war crimes proceedings as a form of retribution. German Jewish DPs also served as witnesses in war crimes trials. Unlike German Jews who chose to return to Germany with the intent of staying, German Jewish DPs did not need to worry about getting along with their German neighbors. Oh, I'm sorry, I had that. All right, so I'll let you read it. And I did pause in his testimony. He made those pauses between those phrases very deliberately. So here we have Lucille Landau, who emigrated after receiving death threats connected with her testimony at a war crimes trial. And as historian Bianca Adams has shown, even non-Nazi Germans hesitated to participate in denazification tribunals because of their unwillingness to sit in judgment on, quote, their own friends and the people they had lived with all their lives, end quote. So participating in the prosecution of war criminals was easier for those who were planning on leaving town or leaving the country. Some German Jewish DPs participated directly in German denazification tribunals. With the repeal of National Socialist racial laws, German Jews who were attorneys were reinstated to the legal profession. In Deggendorf DP camp, Theresienstadt survivor, Dr. Richard Treitel, formerly a prominent Berlin attorney, served as one of the judges for the camp court in the DP camp, but outside of the camp, he provided legal assistance for other survivors and also served as a prosecutor and presiding judge in the Deggendorf town, not the camp, but the Deggendorf town denazification tribunal. A fellow Deggendorf DP was a Jewish convert to Christianity and a former Berlin judge, Dr. Heinrich Liebrecht, also served on the denazification courts. Given the reticence of local Germans to fill positions in the denazification courts, the service of Treitel and Liebrecht filled an important void. Also, their outsider status and temporary residence kept them above the fray of local politics and rivalries. At the same time, I think Liebrecht and Treitel must have found it enormously satisfying to return as officers of a German law court and to sit in judgment on Germans. The records indicate that they were fair in the execution of their duties, and it stands to reason that this work fulfilled a desire for retribution on their parts. And yet, for all of their desire to leave Germany, for all of their bitterness over the betrayals that they and their loved ones had experienced at the hands of former friends, teachers, colleagues, and even family members, German Jewish survivors understood themselves to be German. Ironically, the place where German Jews felt the most free to be German was the same place where they felt the most free to be Jewish, the Deggendorf DP camp. Deggendorf DP camp was unusual in its high proportion of German Jews. In most DP camps, German Jews were a distinct minority and tended to remain amongst themselves. German Jews often held themselves aloof from Eastern European Jews, whom they viewed as less cultured, while Eastern European Jews distanced themselves from German Jews who spoke the language of the perpetrators and who had often rejected traditional Judaism in favor of assimilation. This latter attitude was evident in the reception of the 1948 DP film Lang ist der Weg, or Long is the Road. This film told the story of a Polish Jewish survivor, David, there on the left, who after the war married a German Jewish survivor and awaited immigration to Palestine in a DP camp. Landsberg, actually, is where this takes place. Many Eastern European DPs objected to hearing the German language spoken by someone who was supposed to be a survivor, as well as to a scene in which the protagonist expressed sympathy for expelled ethnic Germans. There's a line sort of like they're being displaced the way we were kind of thing. And anyway, so Eastern European Jewish DPs objected to the film's blurring of the distinction between victim Jews and perpetrator Germans. So it's the reason why there's so many German Jews in Degendorf it's because of those 700 survivors of Theresienstadt who arrived. But then other German Jews who wanted to become DPs, heard about Degendorf and tended to go there to be with other German Jews. So when in the Degendorf DP camp, German Jewish survivors could simply be themselves without apologizing for being either German or Jewish. The yearning for the days when one's German Jewish identity could be sort of taken for granted was exemplified by the first major theatrical production by the German Jewish survivors in the Degendorf DP camp, an operetta set in the Austrian Salzkammergut. A romantic comedy in Weiss und Röse, the White Horse Inn, finds humor in the culture clash between the rural folk of the the Austrian Alps and the urban tourists from the Prussian regions of northern Germany. Based on a popular turn-of-the-century play, the operetta had successful runs in Berlin and Vienna in the early 1930s, and by the mid-1930s played in London and New York and was even adapted into a film. For the residents of the Degendorf DP camp, the theme of Austrian-German conflict, fit with the demographics of the survivors who themselves came from Austria and Germany, with many of the Germans being from Prussian Berlin. The familiar melodies were reminders of happier times. The romantic storyline reflected their own impulses towards marriage and their hopes for a more carefree future. At the same time, the staging of the play required the actors to perform German identities. And the costumes that the DPs fashioned for themselves out of scarce resources were those of traditional Alpine dress. So within the confines of the DP theater, actors and audience were able to reclaim their hybrid pre-1933 identities. That they were all Jews was understood. That they were all Germans and Austrians was also understood. The persecution of the Nazi years had shattered the wholeness of their identities. Others had denied them their Germanness, and now as stateless Jews, they were about to embark on new lives in new places with yet other new identities. But in the Degendorf DP theater, they created a space where they could cheerfully play with the differences between Prussians and Austrians, urban dwellers and country folk. Their Jewishness and their Germanness were simply accepted. One of the performers, Margot Friedlander, remarked that, quote, the Weiße Röse was like a cure for us and for the spectators, end quote. So these German Jewish survivors were performing their German identities, imbued with nostalgia for Germany that remained only in their imaginations. It was also in Degendorf DP camp that these German Jewish survivors came to a mutual understanding with Polish survivors that emphasized a common Jewish identity. The situation was tough when the German Jews first arrived in August 1945. There were a lot of non-Jewish DPs in the camp, and the conditions were horrible, and people were just fighting to get a bed space in this camp. But fortunately, by the end of August, a new UNRWA team arrived. Oops, okay, sorry. Some Theresienstadt survivors arriving in Degendorf. Here we have the UNRWA officials and the gentleman with the cigarette in his mouth and the UNRWA stripe on his sleeve. That's Carl Atkin, who was the head of the team. And Carl Atkin was a great advocate for displaced persons. He helped to set up actually camp courts in the DP centers to give the DPs more jurisdiction over their lives. Anyway, so he comes in, and their task was to create an all-Jewish DP camp here. And so they repatriated all of the other people out. So left with just the Jews. And shortly after this, 350 Polish Jews arrived. And so we have the situation. But also Atkin helped organize the camp committees. They're going to be members from the DPs who are elected to help administer the camp. Now, Theresienstadt survivors were older than most Holocaust survivors. Most Holocaust survivors between the ages of 18 and 24. Theresienstadt, the average age for the ones who came to Degendorf was 50. So older than that. The first committee, the majority of the members were German Jews from Berlin, Cologne, and Vienna. There was one Polish Jew on the committee. Another exception to the leadership was that the youngest member became the chair of the camp committee, and that was 35-year-old Louis Löwy. This is his DP card. Because of his complex background, Löwy was able to serve as a bridge between the different Jewish populations in Degendorf. In 1920, Löwy was born in Munich to a German mother who had converted to Judaism. His father, a Habsburg Jew, would choose to become a citizen of the new country of Czechoslovakia. Thus, Löwy spent the first few years of his childhood in Prague, where the family continued to speak German. In the mid-1920s, the family returned to Munich only to flee Nazism and return to Prague in 1936. Later, Löwy would remark, "I had so many identities that I didn't know which one I was, but I always knew that I was Jewish." Löwy had already established himself as a leader of the Theresienstadt survivors even before they were transferred to Degendorf. And Karl Atkin quickly identified him as the person to and sort of recruit to construct the administration of the Jewish DP camp. But the other thing about Löwy is that he was willing to communicate with the Eastern European Jews, particularly Polish Jews, who were starting to arrive and to Degendorf. He was willing to try using Yiddish to communicate with them. He sanctioned their Zionist activities, and he won the support and admiration of much of the camp population. His vision of the community was shared by other leaders and became a hallmark of the Degendorf DP camp. He would go on to an illustrious career in social work in the United States under the name Louis Löwy. Degendorf DP camp had a German language newspaper, and in it, the camp committee would publish its ideas about rehabilitation and how important things were. They announced the creation of a law court within the DP camp that they thought would help to educate the camp residents on their responsibilities to the community. At the same time, the camp administration developed a wage scale, a camp currency, and a canteen where you could buy things with the camp currency you earned. The idea was to encourage people to go to work on behalf of the community as part of the rehabilitation. But the wages were also taxed at 10% to help cover costs for the elderly and for invalids. So there's this social responsibility along with it. And like we saw in Eddie's slides from the Landsberg camp, that cultural life was very important in all of this. And this was really a main way in which people began to restore their lives and form families and really begin to live again. And so they had theaters, schools, synagogues that all performed a vital function in restoring the survivors and rehabilitating them. And I just want to make a connection to this morning's program where we saw, art programs in the camp in the Kachin, and we also heard about educational centers being established and how important those are. We can see that here in the DP experience as well. Now, these are just tremendously important activities and deserve our support. So German Jews and Polish Jews in Degendorf found common ground in their desire to leave Germany. They had shared goals of emigration that often included Zionist sympathies that they saw as bringing them together. One Polish DP wrote that people with different worldviews and different mentalities, the Jewish cultural spirit has introduced to us in the camp. We found a common language with the entire Jewish people. So And for German Jews, the Degendorf Center Review, there's even a story there about a Zionist meeting in the camp, reported on Zionist demonstrations and on world events related to Palestine. So Louis Louis, in order to prepare everybody for immigration, had asked everyone to fill out forms stating what their preferred country of immigration would be. And so he was ready to go once the Americans opened up their consulate in Munich. So anyway, so in January 1946, approximately 450 Degendorf DPs wanted to immigrate to Palestine, 350 to the United States, 200 to England, 35 to Central and South America, 20 to Australia and New Zealand, and 85 to other locations within continental Europe. Those not going to Palestine were mostly elderly and people who had children living abroad or family living abroad that they wanted to join. In the spring of 1946, Degendorf DPs were increasingly called to Munich for immigration hearings and then transferred to other DP camps for their journeys to new homes. As the German Jews left Degendorf, Eastern European Jews fleeing post-war pogroms replaced them. With the departure of the German Jewish DPs, the Degendorf Center Review ceased publications in mid-1946, although a Yiddish newspaper continued to be issued until the camp closed finally on June 15th, 1949. Unlike other Holocaust survivors, German Jews had shared a common language, history, and culture with the perpetrators. Returning to the land of their birth meant returning to the home of their persecutors. Their tormentors had been their neighbors, their colleagues, their classmates. For those German Jews who became DPs, the betrayal could be neither forgiven nor forgotten. Germany had ceased to be their home. While awaiting emigration, German Jewish DPs were all too aware of their outsider status. At times, they were able to use their Germanness to their advantage, to cross borders, to flesh out war criminals, to exact retribution, and yet they were not at home, despite being on the soil of their birth. In their interactions with other Germans, they were self-conscious of their Jewishness, and among non-Germans, they were ceaselessly reminded of their Germanness. Only among themselves were they free to be both Germans and Jews. Once they left the DP camps for their new homes abroad, they would be destined to take on new identities and to engage in a never-ending negotiation of what it meant to be German Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. Thank you. So happy to answer some questions.
Thank you. This was so well done. My question, it's not really a question, or it's kind of, I'm pondering. The religious identity of, if you can break it down, of these German Jews. So you mentioned synagogues, but do we able to break down different kinds of synagogues? And if that's the case, you know, who's strong, kind of who is more popular? That would be one element. Then the Jewishness versus the Zionist identity. That's a second question, how those two work. But still, it seems to me from some of the quotes that you shared with us, that there's a sense of Jewishness is almost transcends anything else. Even though you don't know what it is, you know you're Jewish. So what on earth does that mean to you? So those are kind of the three elements of the question about Jewishness.
All right, so I don't have a breakdown on the synagogues. The ones I read about were Orthodox synagogues, and it was mostly the Eastern European Jews who established them. So now Rabbi Leo Beck, who was a Reform rabbi or progressive rabbi in Berlin and had survived in Theresienstadt, he goes straight to England. So he was not in Degendorf. Had he been there, then I would have, we could be certain that there would have been something along those lines. The DPs, like Levy, he was secular. And yet, as he says, he always knew he was Jewish. And in that kind of situation, to me, it's because everybody knows I'm Jewish. I look Jewish. I can't escape being Jewish. It reminds me of yesterday when Bob Morgenthau was talking about, I think it was his father was in a cab, and the cabbie says, so what airline, El Al? The cabbie just could tell, oh, you must be a Jew. I think that's part of what some of these people were feeling. I know that, like Ruth Kluger, she was very aware of her Jewish appearance. And in fact, in that story, so when she and her mother, and then basically her foster sister, it was a girl they adopted in the camps, who was also from Vienna, when they first went to present themselves to the mayor as these ethnic German refugees, the mayor took one look at Ruth and was like, what about this one? And so her mother made up a story that she had an affair with a Jew, and this was the product of it. And if you can imagine how that feels to have your mother sort of having to disown your father just so you can. Anyway, but the mayor accepted that, and when it did not turn them in or anything. So there's a sense, I think, some of which that you couldn't deny that for some of these people, you couldn't deny you were Jewish, but then there were obviously other ones where they were able to pass, like Bertolt Strauss, and then, likes having that sort of hidden identity that he can then reveal when he wants it to, and wants, to use it as a revenge declaration. Let's see, that was two, the third
So
one.
the other one is the Zionism versus the non-Zionist.
Yeah, so most of the German Jews were not Zionists, even before the war. Although with some of them, I do get the sense that with some of the younger ones, that they became Zionists over the course of the persecution, of the course of the Holocaust, and even having it affirmed after the war by the fact that nobody wanted to let the Jews in. And so, and I think that's why Löwy, even though he himself was not a Zionist, was not planning to immigrate to Palestine, wanted to work with and support Zionist efforts. And so I think that's sort of how it comes down. I think a lot of, we even see I'm now thinking just more broadly in the DP population, there were a number of like Bundists who are, there were socialists, Jewish socialists who favored Yiddish culture and wanted to create, a better life where they were. They wanted to stay in Russia or Poland or whatever. And in the DP camps, they supported the Zionists. And these were groups that had been at each other's throats before, but because there was this sense that the Jews have to stick together. And so even though they weren't planning to move to Israel, they want to make certain the others have the opportunity. So,
I think we have time for one more question.
if I answer it quickly, sorry.
So have you looked at other camps as well? I know you said you talked about this one here. Have you looked at any of the other camps, like perhaps ones that were formerly used as concentration camps? Was that a different experience for the DPs that affected them in different ways than you see it like what I assume is a
Degendorf is a former military installation, and so it was very nice. Yeah, and then there are other ones that are more barracks or
picture of knockout?
yeah. So yeah, they ended up the Americans finally got smart and started moving people out of the concentration camps, and then places like Dachau became prison camps for SS men, or later on they became camps for the ethnic Germans who kept coming across the border. But certainly in the initial period before the American people were basically housed, and the only thing that changed was that the guards were no longer Germans, but they were Americans. And that was one of the things that came up in Earl Harrison's report. Truman, he was a dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and Truman sent him in the summer 1945 to check out the rumors he'd been hearing about Jews being mistreated. And he's the one who recommended the creation of separate DP camps. And he said something along the lines of, we're still running the concentration camps, nothing has changed, they're still behind barbed wire, it's just we don't kill them. And so that was clearly something they then tried to take care of. The British because they didn't want to recognize the Jews as a separate group, because that might have implications for recognizing Zionist claims in Palestine. They kept the Jews with the other populations and led to some anti-Semitic attacks on Jews. So the British then tried to segregate them within Belsen. What they ended up doing was burning down Belsen because of typhus and moving them to a nearby German installation, taking it over, moving them there, and that was Hona. And so that's how the British refer to it. It's the Hona DP camp, but the Jewish survivors continue to call it Belsen because it had, sympathy value if you kept saying you were still in Belsen after the liberation. Did I get it?
Yeah, and just real quick, I noticed the card on one of the, I think it was Lovies, said inmate. Still, was that the language generally used for DP?
Yeah,
And how, I mean,
they were inmates. Yeah, and there was also, that was, I think, just instead of residents.
right.
Yeah, and then, oh shoot, I was thinking of another situation where, it was Victor Klemperer who wrote about the misuse of language by the Nazis. And he was very upset towards the end of his diary about Germans calling Dachau survivors, calling them convicts, as if they'd been legitimately convicted of a crime rather than victims of persecution. But again, so that's how people were thinking of them.
Join me in thanking.
Thank you.